so excited we're having this talk right now. I was just talking to him. I had so many questions. This is going to be 4 hours. I hope you're ready. Buckle up, bud.
I'm here to hunt, man. Yeah, I think training with your shotgun's great if you're in wild birds all the time, but like I'm here max 2 weeks out of the year. I'm not going to make a crazy chasing fool up here out of a finished dog, but I would shoot at the bird that got up 40 yards behind him. I would shoot at a bird that flushed wild off to my right while he was running to my left. I don't care. Like if a grouse gets up and gives me a look while I'm out here, I'm probably going to pull the trigger. It's just got to give me a look. I'll sort out whatever I got to sort out at home.
It's little incremental improvements over a long period of time. Like that's really what dog training is. And what I like about that is it rewards people that will stay committed to a process and be willing to accept that the progress you made today was this much. And that's what I think is really the distinction between a good dog trainer and somebody that can just communicate the concepts. Is there's a lot of people that can tell you the right thing in theory. There are not as many people that are going to go work with that dog in 5-minute chunks multiple times a day after day, week after week, year after year, and then build up to something that's very impressive.
It's just cool to see how everyone thinks about it a little bit differently. I think the key point in all that is like we're all very thoughtful and have a lot of reason why we're doing or thinking certain ways or going about it the ways that we do. That's why I still love this stuff, man, because it's art. We can get sciencey about it, but like this is still art.
I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. Grayson Geyer, Randall Likens, Nate Zarnota, and then, of course, myself. When a whole bunch of dog nerds come to grouse camp, there's got to be certain things that we're looking for on the dogs. And you just said that it's all about the dog work for you. You just got your first bird over point. What's it like transitioning to something like rough grouse when all year long we're just doing the dog training stuff with pigeons and quail? How's that bridge? Because I think a lot of people in their head think that it's going to be this seamless transition from planted quail or pigeon in a launcher, come out here, and then they're just going to stick and hold as steady on these rough grouse as what we do in the training field.
I think one of the mistakes I made early on coming from a pet dog training and obedience background was thinking that not understanding or recognizing that book smarts and street smarts are two different things. And so, you can prepare your dog as well as you want, field work, yard work, and that sort of stuff, but you can't teach them to hunt wild birds. You have to allow them to learn that, and so I feel really good about my dogs now because we do take a lot of trips now and we hunt a variety of birds and a variety of cover. And to be able to, like the dog I had down this afternoon, she's 4 now. I got her when she was 1, and I can put her down on any new species and in any new cover, and she picks it up pretty fast. And that's I feel very good about that. So that's been cool.
Yeah, I think for me, it's all like I love bringing young dogs to places like this, and and if it were up to me, all of my young dogs would experience this before I ever put a pinch collar on them and exposed them to a pen raised quail. Like if I could magically start on wild birds from the get go and just take the walks and I don't even a lot of times worry about getting them into cover off the bat. Like I'll just let them get comfortable walking on a logging road, and then we'll move into cover a little bit, and every once in a while I'll bring out an older dog. But that's not, I don't have that luxury. It depends on the time of year I get the dog, where we're at in training, and I'm gonna obviously, I want to get my gun intro in, so I like to get them bird crazy and I do all that stuff. But I really like to see the lights begin to come on. And if I got, on this trip, when it's all said and done, I'll have had maybe 7 days hunting, and I don't expect either of the two dogs the yearlings I'm developing right now to have pointed a bird before I left. But both of them have made contact. Both of them know what they smell like. Both of them have had birds shot around them. They're bumping and people are shooting, and I'm happy with it. And so I'm not worried a lick about any sort of manners at this point, but I just love seeing young birds get crazy in the woods and have fun, and we'll go home and kind of maybe help them put some pieces together in their head before next season. But this is, I wish I had this opportunity much more of the year, but I don't. And it's fun to bring my older dog up here who he's handled a couple of birds really nicely on this trip so far. He's had a couple of weird ones where, you know,
Would it be rough grouse hunting if there weren't weird
yeah, just weird.
encounters?
Yeah, where the bird gets up 40 yards behind him, but he's convinced it's 3 feet in front of his nose.
Yeah.
Like those. But it's fun, and then the ones that do get up in front of him, those are just as surprising and exciting, and um, yeah, it's I think grouse are a very special bird, and unfortunately, I haven't had the woodcock contacts I was hoping for while I was up here too, because I think they're such a great combination together. If you have those young dogs with you, um, and they're they're probably my two favorite birds, and they're in the same place. So
I'm super glad you said that too about bringing young dogs out and no expectations other than have fun and kill birds, man.
yeah,
I feel like too many people come out and puppy's got a point, he's got to do this, got to do that. And it's like, nah, man, we're out here just having fun, just killing birds and teaching them to love the game.
I think a lot of that comes from people, and we've said it a number of times on this podcast, where you can kind of overgeneralize and say only shoot pointed birds, but there's context to that when you're talking about a young puppy for year of still piecing together. They still need to learn to want to go find those birds. They want to, they have to want to find the birds before they can even develop a point on them. And it is a balancing act because everybody gets a pointing dog because they want to see their dog's point. And then, what ends up happening is you go in the woods and you're missing opportune times to really kind of connect the dots for a young dog. And that's something that it's really worked out in my favor with having Woody on the truck this year. The puppy walks. I mean, a 5-month-old puppy, and I mean, every walk except for one, we've had grouse contacts. He's pointed multiple birds. He's now had multiple birds in his mouth. Like the dots are connected, and you see that every single walk. More bold, more confident, more range, more everything. Just a better understanding of what it is. And if you get too caught up into I'm only going out and it's a failed trip if your dog didn't point birds, it's a long road uphill.
yeah, and I think uh, a big part of that is you, they may not be ripping birds. I think one thing that's really important is I always think of incidental contacts, and it's so hard there's no way to replicate the kind of blind approach to the field that you have when you're hunting wild birds when you're training. And so even if you go out and fly a box of quail out into a field, you know what you got somewhere, and you know kind of what to expect, and you know what you're looking for. And then of course those birds are going to act, whatever way they act, and it's normally not going to be like a wild bird. Um, but to see that puppy have that incidental contact for the first time and be surprised by it, but be excited by it, and then maybe the second through, depending on the dog, 30th, 40th contact, go out there, throw their nose up, be excited, and kind of stumble into the bird, and it bumps away, and they're not pointing yet, and you're worried, are they going to develop point at all? And then, bam, like that 31st contact, they go in there and like stick it, and none of that's taught. That's all experienced, and it's something that it's irreplicable. You don't have to have it to make a dog pass a test, but you have to have it if you're going to make a grouse dog.
You got what Randall's talking about the dogs they have to like it, right? They have to be figuring out the game, and you got to know they really like the birds. And I think the way that you know that is when you see them working really hard to find stuff, and you see them get excited when they have indicators that they're getting close to something, right? They hit that scent cone or they hit a track, right? We were talking about this puppy I got, Toad's tail, just does full windmills, man, when he's tracking, which is just the cutest thing ever. And so, like, we want to give the dog rewards for free first, right, to get them hooked, and then you start making them do work. And then I talk to people a lot about rewarding good effort. And so I think when you get into this, especially with the young dogs, you get in this place where I'm only gonna shoot a pointed bird. There's a whole lot of good work a dog could do before that, and especially on these birds. I mean, like early season sharptail, maybe I could understand that a little bit, right? There's not really a whole lot of tracking, that they hold real tight, and then but here, I mean, there's a whole lot of really good work a dog could do. They could have no intention of ripping a bird off the ground. They're tracking, and that bird gets up, you know, 20, 30 yards out in front of them, and they were doing good work. I would shoot that bird. I don't know.
Well, and
Maybe other people feel different, but
that exact scenario is what happened to Woody. I can think of is 4 or 5 grouse he's pointed now, and there just wasn't even the opportunity to connect. And so he handled birds, pointed birds, and rough grouse are just going to act like rough grouse, and you don't even get a shot opportunity. But if I held to that standard from then on, the 2 birds that I had the opportunity to actually put down on the ground for him, he wouldn't have had that in his mouth and had that, real puppy party, that connect the dots, that aha moment. Like, yes, I knew that scent meant something. If I went off of the point only rule, then I wouldn't have shot those birds for him. But to your point, he worked them. He sat there and was picking up odor, following the scent. Bird gets up, shot. Here's the party, and he was more motivated to go search and find the next one after that. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that's all you're talking about is just reward the initial finding of the scent, and I can worry about all the other pointing and steadiness and all that other stuff later at home if I need to. But it's amazing how fast these young dogs catch on if you just give them the space to kind of screw up and figure it out on their own.
Yeah, I shoot mishandled and unhandled birds for my finished dogs while I'm here. I'm here to hunt, man. And I think it's something people. Yeah, I think training with your shotgun's great if you're in wild birds all the time. But like I'm here max 2 weeks out of the year. If I get to travel any more than this, like I'm really lucky. Um, I'll sort out whatever I got to sort out at home, and I'm not going to make a crazy chasing fool up here out of a finished dog, but I shot a stop to flush, or I shot at a stop to flush for Pete, and did not connect on this trip. And I would do that tomorrow. I would shoot at the bird that got up 40 yards behind him. I would shoot at a bird that flushed wild off to my right while he was running to my left. I don't care. Like if a grouse gets up and gives me a look while I'm out here, I'm probably going to pull the trigger. It's just got to give me a look, and that it's there's times depending on where you're hunting. We were hunting a lot of dense aspen thickets early, and you can have birds flush 15 yards away from you and never get a look at them when you're in stuff like that. So I'm of the personal opinion, if you're like gonna drop your money to come do something like this, like get out of the experience what you want.
Yeah.
If that means you want to be reserved, by all means do it. I don't withhold shots because I'm trying to train my dogs. I withhold shots because I know I'm not going to hit the bird, or it's unsafe, or I'm usually doing something else like looking at my phone, or got my gun broke, or something like that.
All experiences every single one of us has dealt with at one point or another. How do we square that though, especially when you're advising somebody that's brand new to this and maybe they're curious, like you hear there's not a separate training season and hunting season, that you're always training. Don't let the standard slip once you get up there. How do you square that and advise the other people beyond just like, whatever you want? Because oftentimes when you talk to people barely entering the world, they don't know what they want.
all the problems people are worried about creating get created on pen raised birds with bad flying pen raised birds and bad cover in your training. And so I just think, like, if somebody's actually hunting their dog on wild birds, even if you shot every bird you could shoot, however it was handled, there's going to be so many contacts that's not going to happen with that. Your reinforcement history is never going to be such that it would create a problem for you. I don't think. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I agree. I 100% agree with that. Like I think if this is all I had access to, I could go out and shoot at every bird possible, and most dogs are still going to make a bird
You'd
dog.
have a dog that probably breaks on the shot, but
Yeah, and then you can sort that out once you get to that place.
I mean, you're kind of describing my oldest dog.
Yeah.
right? So like pen raised birds out in training field, he, as a young dog, like 7, 8 months old, kill it, take him to go hunt wild birds. Things happened, and I'm like Grayson, like I'm out there to hunt. I'm
Yeah.
gonna shoot. So I mean, you saw some naughty things in the field from time to time, but he's figured it out. He's fine now. You can go run him on quail down south or rough grouse up here, and he handles them fine.
I,
Like
I think people forget how often I almost said a bad word, how often they mess it up. Like we're always worried about the dog messing something up. How many birds you miss that were handled fantastically, right? That kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
Like ones it couldn't have been an easier shot, and you whiff, and so that's the other part I think on balance. Just trying to remember.
So y'all think on the average dog, what y'all just said, that y'all think we could go out there and the average bird dog with, assuming the genetics are there and they're from hunting stock, if you just go shoot every single bird out there, if they're wild birds, the dog is still going to become a wild bird dog eventually.
Uh, you said something in there that's the indicator, the key indicator, which is shoot every bird. Like I can't remember what George Evans said about like what a good grouse shot is, but I know for some of the better shots I've been with, I would say sub 25%, and that's if they're being really selective. And so if you're looking at trying to put the dropped bird on a randomized schedule, like grouse do it for you. Right?
Right.
Like
do a really good
it's
job of it.
yeah, like so, I mean the shot is a shot and that can indicate a bird falling. For some dogs it doesn't, for some shooters it doesn't. My dogs are very used to hearing me shoot and not seeing a bird fall out of the sky. So, I think the birds are going to carry the lion's share of the work when you're especially in grouse, but in most wild birds, and I think probably quail, if you had access to them, would be similar to some degree, But yeah, I think if you had these opportunities to go hunt, then go hunt, and if you got to deal with training stuff, then remember that. And I guess there are some things that I might consider in the field. Most of them are just going to be willful, kind of renegade young dog stuff, but it's more about handle than it is about your bird work.
I think the only caveat I have for that is like older dogs that have been allowed to mishandle poorly planted pen raised birds for a long time. Then when I enter this space, things change because I I don't think that those dogs can. It's hard for them to let go of that. So now that I have the opportunity to have good, solid birds that will do what we ultimately want to recreate, like now I'll take advantage of that. So there's like one caveat to that. But if I have a good green dog that's a young up and comer or an older experienced dog, I'm like Grayson, I'm probably going to shoot most things. But those older dogs that have had a lot of reinforcement history do the wrong thing, I feel like you just create an absolute monster out here if you start doing that
Yeah, I mean,
with those dogs.
if you've got a habitual ripper out here, then you're dealing in something different. Like if you've had your time to become, like you've shown me that you know what they smell like, and you're not doing what your genetics tell you to do, then I'll try to intervene. But I think most of us are looking for the dogs that have the genetic propensity to do the work. But if um, I don't think I would be inclined to let a dog continue to chase a lot out here if they're just going and ripping birds, and I know better for
Yeah.
that dog. But that said, that's gonna it's gonna be a long time. It's gonna be a couple seasons of giving you an opportunity to develop before I step in. In a wild bird scenario.
Yeah, it's one of those. I guess it's a delicate balance because my mind automatically goes to the guy that's struggling for their dogs. Say 2, 3 years old, to start establishing point on wild birds, and you start talking to them, that you start unpacking what they're doing in the training field, and whether it's pen raised birds or even pigeons. My eyes have been kind of opened a lot to where when you get in the field with them, just how unrealistic the planted birds are, whether it is pen raised or even launchers. Like so many people, Randall, you and I talk about this all the time, just the timing of launching the bird. It's like it's almost counterproductive to what you're supposed to try to be simulating in the field, and vice versa. Then you have some people that they'll go put a young bird in a kick trap, and then the dog just rips the trap. And so like when you start unpacking why the dog is ripping wild birds, more often than not it is created in the training field with the best intentions in mind, to where we're trying to simulate wild birds, but we're just kind of failing on numerous fronts, to where usually it's a management problem in the field when you kind of unpack it all.
I think with that said, I do think no matter how bad you screw up training, how bad your launcher timing is, as long as your dog wants to do it, there's a really good chance that these birds would rehab any anything you screwed up along the way. Like given enough time and enough opportunities. Um,
Yeah, as long as you stop taking the poison.
yeah, yeah. Like doesn't mean go home after this experience and launch pigeons in your dog's face after they've drug you to the launcher. Um, but yeah, I think if this is all we had, like we'd all have better gun dogs. Like like gun dogs. Doesn't mean more finished, but in terms of producing birds for the gun, like
But
I
then
don't.
what would we do? March
Yeah.
through.
So everybody that's listening to this, training is worthless. Don't worry about it.
I was about to say it's y'all's livelihoods. Y'all are just creating this. Like, you know what? Just go spend a couple weeks in the Northwoods and it'll balance out.
I mean, it all depends on your objectives. Like if what you want to do is hunt wild birds, and there's only one thing that's going to get you there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few. Yeah, obviously you have to make sure you're preparing yourself and your dog to go do that safely and effectively. Um, that's pretty minimal work, and then everything beyond that is for us. It's not for connecting with birds in the field.
How do we square this with the fact that all of these games, all of the hunt tests especially, are supposed to simulate that, and then kind of what we're talking about, the behind the scenes of that culture, the hunt test culture, if it's not actually accomplishing what it set out to do, the mission, so to speak, is there really value in the hunt test program then?
Value is a interesting thing because it's pretty subjective, right?
Right.
Like
Whatever.
so.
Yeah. I mean, I guess everybody does it for a different reason, but if all in all, the overall mission is supposed to simulate wild birds, and we're saying that there's so much within that that can not replicate that or simulate that, then where does that leave us?
I mean, you use the keyword simulation. It's not a perfect recreation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So,
think a lot of it depends on the intent of the person. Like we see some people that come to our NAVTA chapter and they're very interested in testing their dog, and some of them don't hunt at all. And then you have other people that come in and their goal is to have a good hunting dog, and this is one component in their process of creating that. And I think that makes a difference. And you see the same thing in, I think some people run hunt tests because they want to say they have a dual purpose dog, right? I have my dog wins in the confirmation ring, and then they got some ribbons for doing, like some work too, and then, but that's all it is sometimes, right? And then other people just, they do different stuff. But that was what I was saying, is like I kind of started out as that person that came into this from the training perspective more, and then you start really traveling to hunt and trying to get after wild birds, and you realize that is a completely different skill set. They're complementary if you do it right, but they're not the same at all, and then it's like you don't get credit for that work to some degree either, right? So
That's
it's
right.
like you're sitting there all the time and effort you put into stuff, but it's a different thing,
I do think it's easy for, and and now that you say that, it's probably a bit unfair to say that that stuff doesn't matter because I think I take that for granted that I spent the last 25 years of my life obsessing on training dogs, and so a lot of the essential basics that that are assumed in what a young dog is going to have for me probably don't exist for a novice.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of things just like a simple recall where my dog is still willing to get out and hunt afterward,
Hmm.
or and so I think there's a lot of value in training in the off season. But I think, that value is in establishing some very fundamental skills and spending a lot of time with your dog in a field environment, which is something I do every day of my life. And so yeah, it's unfair to say, yeah, just come turn your young dog out in the woods. I wouldn't recommend that if your dog's never been off a leash or out of your backyard.
I think the way people should look at it is the stuff that you do in training, whether it's just yard work in your backyard or you're working towards hunt tests like NAVDA or AKC or whatever you're doing, is like those skills are what make two things. I think it makes your dog enjoyable to hunt with, and not annoying to other people, so you probably get invited on more hunts, and then and keep them safe, right? And then the other thing I think for me is, and I think it's important that people think about obedience this way, is like obedience should be the avenue that the dog can use to achieve their goals. So like if I whistle for my dog because I want him to turn, or I tone him on the collar, or I try to give him a cast, the idea is I want you to listen to that because I'm trying to put you in a place where I think there's a higher likelihood that I can see something that maybe you don't recognize, and then you can do the dog thing that I can't do, right? Which is use your nose and actually find the bird, you know. But I don't have big running dogs, so I got to put them in the right cover, and then they'll do the rest of that stuff. But
Call that being 50% of the team.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, the dog's got the nose and they can use it, but it's sometimes based on wind direction, terrain, and all the other things I'm cover what I'm looking at. Like sometimes Dad does know a little better, and I need to move you and get you where you can be successful.
and that's kind of the rule for me when we're out here doing this stuff, is if whatever I'm gonna try to do as far as obedience goes, if it's not going to improve on what's already happening, then I should probably shut up and mind my own business.
And I think there's value, and there's something that definitely, like you said, in terms of getting the invite back. But then there's also, what do you want out of the experience?
Yeah.
And if it's just to have, uh, you know, a dog that is operating independently, then you don't need a whole lot.
Yeah.
But I don't think most of us out there are after that. We're looking for that partner.
You said something that was pretty important in all that, that it depends on your goal. And then you also mentioned earlier your buddy Stump. And you did a podcast episode recently that really kind of hit on a lot of this topic right here, to when it comes to building just a true bird dog, a hunting dog. The what do you guys call it? The non-training training culture.
Training.
Yeah, yeah, and and Stump embodies that. And it would be unfair to say that he has like low standards for his dogs otherwise, um, because he has just a very natural way of training, and I don't go out to a field and dump all my dogs out to air at one time. If they were mine, I would, but I always have a couple of dogs in the mix that don't suit that. And so for me, like, everything is pretty rigid and structured. A lot of chain gang time, a lot of moving back and forth, a lot of one dog out at a time, unless I'm very comfortable and I know I got a handle on things. And Stump will go, just back into a hayfield somewhere and dump 9 little crazy French Britneys out in the field. And as he calls them, they come in one by one by name. And we pour a lot of time and effort into training and to teaching people how to train. And Stump doesn't put nearly as much time into thinking about it as any of the four of us do, and it works. And so there's something to that. And then he cuts 4 or 5 young dogs out at a time and lets them go crazy and rip birds, and they start figuring it out one by one, and he learns who to put away and who to keep down, and he kills birds over them, and it's hard to argue with it. But at the end of the day, I think also he spends an inordinate amount of time with his dogs compared to a lot of people, and he is a fishing guide that also spends a ton of time when he's not fishing with his dogs and not doing much else. And so, not everybody has that luxury. Um, and all that said, he's still training. I mean, you watch him and watch him interact with the dogs, and they're getting treats and they're being admonished in very specific ways. And so he may not be uh, trying to articulate it in a way that makes sense to everybody else, but he's absolutely conditioning those dogs and lifestyle stuff. Um, but it's there's a natural approach, and I think it takes a lot of time and experience to get to where you're intuiting your way through something like that. And I think, um, that there's value in formal training if what you want is to, roll up with your friends and not embarrass yourself because your dog's well mannered. you know,
I think a lot of your job, if you're trying to help other people learn about this stuff, is you're codifying things and adding structure to stuff that when you see it done the best, like I think we probably hopefully can all agree that like when you watch a guy like that work, or like when I watch Pat Nolan work dogs, there's an artfulness to it
yeah.
that I don't think I have. I think I'm a pretty good technician now, but I'm still working on that part where it looks effortless, because it sure as shit doesn't feel effortless, you know?
That's interesting. I think we're all working towards the effortless part. If we're people that try, I'm a much less structured person by nature. But that being said, like I spend a lot of time thinking about it and trying. Um, and I tend to scoff and act as if I'm relying on intuition a lot, but most of the time I'm really thinking deeply about what I need to be doing and what I'm doing wrong. And it would be nice to get to that place where I'm not.
I just feel like it's just like shooting. Like when you first start wing shooting and go try to shoot clays and things, everything moves way too fast for you.
Yeah.
And it's just when you have to think through every step, then you're always behind,
Yeah.
right? And like that's where a guy like your friend, the his ability to just do what he does and read the situation and adjust on the fly, and like, well, even some of the stuff you were talking to me about hunting these birds that we're here to hunt now, you just like you gain certain experience, and then everything slows down for you a whole lot, and then you start realizing you have a lot more time, and there's a lot more space between the things that are happening, and
And but there's so much value in being a technician, and I think when you talk about shooting, you know, whether it be a shotgun or a rifle or a pistol or whatever you're doing, if you learn it in a structured way, um, then you become proficient to the point where you're relying on reflex,
yeah,
and I think that's everything. I think that's all learning, and
yeah.
especially when it's coupled with, um, you know, any locomotion from your body, having to operate intuitively.
So, I mean, how do we go about balancing it out to where I think at the end of the day, you have certain types of people. You have the stumps of the world. I love how he was just talking about, man, I just trained my dog how to handle in the living room. It was the bag of Doritos, and I love that, especially coming off of the tail end of like the more modern Nepopo series that I did. It was awesome, like getting to hear that right after the real heady dog talk. So you have the stumps of the world, but then you also have us to where we kind of will lean into the real heady dog training stuff. And some people would say that overthinking things and really kind of giving too much thought to it. How do you go about keeping it simple and grounded while putting in the necessary thought to do this in a more, I don't know, efficient way, or just a way that makes sense to you and the dog? Like, what's the best advice that you could give somebody just trying to figure out that balance?
For me personally, you know, the the knowledge of behavioral principles is extremely important to me. And it's, so the way I teach, I tend to put that forward with my clients. and I tend to rely less on the mechanics. I need to rely more on the mechanics. I recognize that being a gap in my abilities or effectiveness as an instructor. Um, but I also think like familiarize yourself with the basic principles, and then from there start looking at kind of the flow chart of where you want to be from there as a trainer. And so that's why I spend so much time talking about it and thinking about it, because I think that is very important if you want to move forward effectively um, without tons of trial and error. It's just having a basic understanding of the entire field of play.
Yeah, I find it interesting, Nate. Our last episode, I asked you one question with some very clear people in mind of how do we talk to the people that get really super heady into the language and the theory, but they can't hold a leash in their hands. And then vice versa, somebody that, can train a hell of a dog, but can't put two words together to try and explain what they're doing. And what I thought was interesting is a lot of the same people that I had in my head of why I asked that question, each side of that spectrum left with your response in a completely different interpretation, to where you said, and a lot of the people that focus in on the language and the theory aren't the best dog trainers. But when you said that, they left and they heard the part of where you talked about how we can't talk about these things colloquially and we had to have a set and hard language, so they left hearing that. Meanwhile, I heard from the other side, like, yeah, see, they're not good trainers, but they know all the theory and language. And I thought it was interesting that both sides of the camp left hearing exactly what they wanted to hear rather than what they should. And it goes back to what we're talking about here is like finding the right balance, especially for the average person. And it's hard to do because everybody's unique and what brings them to the space. But it is one of those, like, you find yourself in that conversation a lot to where, some days I'm in the mood to really nerd out about the training and the theory, but other days it's like, you know what? Like, if you can't actually take a leash in hand and apply this information, what good does it do?
So I just think training dogs and training people are two very different skill sets, right? So if I have a dog that's coming in for board and train, then I'm training that dog. But if I'm teaching somebody in private lessons, I'm instructing the person on how to interact with their dog in order to get their dog trained. And so those are very different things, and not everybody is great at both of those. And I think you see this a lot. Like there's some really really high performing, like objectively, some of the best dog trainers that are alive are not the best communicators with people, right? It like happens sometimes. And then you have some people that are very good at articulating ideas and concepts to people that maybe aren't as good with a leash. And there's a place for all of those folks, because it doesn't matter if you're 87-time IGP world champion if you can't communicate basic information to the average person that's trying to pay you money to train a dog. And I like, the trouble is that the end consumer can get in a lot of I think they end up going to the wrong people sometimes, because it's very easy now on social media or in whatever other information we put out online, where I can say all the right things but I can't really do it. And so it's easy to convey that information. I can go get my certification. I passed a multiple choice test. I read the book and I gave the right answers. Um, and then a lot of those people fall short when it actually comes time to do the work. Like we were talking about, I watched a trainer at a seminar get tagged by a dog. And like, we knew the dog was dicey when the dog came in. Like the handler talked about it, and then like he's sitting down with the dog. It was like, why are you sitting with this dog that's got a muzzle on, like right here, when you know that dog, its MO is like, it's gonna say like, "Hey man, how you doing?" And then it's gonna tag you. Like that was the go-to move for the dog. Like we knew that, and so you just see that stuff. Some of those things get like misplayed, and to me that's evidence of a lack of experience with that particular situation, and so I think you can see that stuff happen a lot of times. And the biggest thing with dog training for me, man, is it rewards people. You talked about this on the podcast you just did with Emily recently, and I really liked it. As you said, in your regular life, you weren't necessarily that structured, but when you go out and work with dogs every day and you're measuring your success, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but it's like it's little incremental improvements over a long period of time. Like that's really what dog training is. And what I like about that is it rewards people that will stay committed to a process and be willing to accept that the progress you made today was this much. And that's what I think is really the distinction between a good dog trainer and somebody that can just communicate the concepts. Is there's a lot of people that can tell you the right thing in theory. There are not as many people that are going to go work with that dog in 5-minute chunks multiple times a day, day after day, week after week, year after year, and then build up to something that's very impressive over a long period of time. And so I think that's most of it. And so, when we're working with clients, we try to cover a lot of the leash handling stuff and the important conceptual information and some of the important hands-on things. But it's one of the reasons why I try to structure all my programs where I tell people up front, like, if you think I'm going to work a dog for 3 weeks and then give it back to you and then we're not going to interact anymore, that's not how I want to do this stuff. So we do a lot of group classes and a lot of ongoing work because I think there are some things that can be learned but can't be taught, right? Like you learn it by spending time doing it, but it's not a thing that's easy for someone else to just tell you about, and then you'll be able to kind of take it and apply it. And I think that's kind of the same thing that happens, what I was talking about with dogs, training them versus taking them out and having them hunt wild birds. I can't teach my dog how to hunt wild birds, but they can learn how to hunt wild birds. And so I can't teach people to read dogs. Like I'll watch stuff on Instagram sometimes where folks are trying to tell you about dog body language and how you would be able to predict that this dog was going to bite you. And they're like, well, look at the tail and look at the ears and look at the hackles and look at the posture. And it's like, okay, so that's a still, and you've spent 5 minutes explaining this. And like, that was a fraction of a second of a moment in time. And so there's no person that hasn't just been around dogs long enough to know. You just get that feeling sometimes, man. Like that dog looks at you a certain way or they tighten up a certain way. And then, it's a thing that you learn, but it's not a thing. Like no one's been able to effectively deal with that based on the thing somebody said to them, Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think the most important thing you said in there was like the incremental wins. 'Cause that's what I tell my clients all the time. Like, recognize and take the small victories. Like, that's all you're getting every day. Like that, if you're getting that every time you go out to the field or every time you do a session with your dog, as long as you can identify those and be happy with those, that's what we're after. Like that, when I go out to work a dog, I'm not going out to make leaps. I'm not going to the training field with a dog that's ripping birds and hoping that he'll be steady, right? Like I'm just looking for those small little victories. And I talk to so many people who want to make those big jumps super fast, and that's just not realistic. There's a dog out there that will make me a liar with that, but most of the time it's just recognizing the small wins and being happy with that, and then realizing that sometimes those small victories are a correction, right? It's something that I had to apply, but did the dog learn, right? And if he did, there's your win, right? I've gone out and handled dogs doing blinds and stuff. It's like, well, that didn't go super clean, but I got my whistles in, right? I got my casts in. The dog was doing these things correctly. I need to go fix some other stuff or keep working on some things, but look at all the other great things that happened. I think that would help people stop being frustrated, which is what I think a lot of people, that's when they resort to heavy-handed pressure, and that's where issues start to arise, at least in what I see. So take your small wins.
Most people aren't in a place where they can make really informed decisions about that stuff either. So like you get a dog that comes in and somebody's like, I really need this dog steadied by the time they come back. And then you're advising them that, look, I think there's some other things that are probably higher priority here. And then they don't want to hear that. Well, you get to make a decision then about how you want to handle that stuff. And ultimately, if this is your livelihood, then your customer needs to be happy.
Yep.
But you just would hope that people would you're supposed to be their smart friend, right? They're paying you because you're the subject matter expert. So you'd really hope that they would kind of.
This is funny because Grayson, you posted something a couple weeks ago that cracked me up a little bit, and I think I shared it with Randall. Of you go to the doctor, and the doctor says you got to do this, you got to do this to live a healthier and better life, and then it's like, oh, what does he know? And then it's just like, oh, that's me as a dog trainer.
Yeah.
And so, how do you guys handle this as you're having this conversation with your client? If it doesn't align with their objectives and their goals, they're paying you as the subject matter to produce a certain dog that they're hoping for, but you guys are recognizing, hey, you want to get to, Z, we got to go all the way through the ABCs to get there. But the owner's sitting there like, no, I want this. This is what I'm paying you for.
I explained the fallout first. I don't know about you guys.
Well, there was a very popular pet dog trainer on the seminar circuit for a while, and the thing that he would always say was, "I don't have any right to tell somebody else when they're happy,"
Yeah.
which I think is bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, and I think Michael Ellis's kind of opinion on this is a lot better. And he says, like, our job as dog trainers is to get people into this stuff, like to get people to care about it, and to get people to recognize the value and to want to do more with their dogs. And I think that, that standards have always been a big thing for me. I like training to objective standards. I feel like we talked about this before about any profession, you're kind of managing time, cost, and scope of your work. And I think that that's part of being a professional, is your ability to do those things. And so when I hear like a professional trainer say, we get where we get whenever we get there, or it doesn't matter, if this is good enough for them, it's good enough for, no, it's not. It's not at all appropriate, I think, for us, if we're taking money from people, to kind of do stuff that way.
I mean, the only thing I can do is advise them. Like I said, I start with the fallout of like, that's what you want as a professional. Like, I'm telling you, here's where we're at and what it's going to take to get here. And if we go down the route you want, this is what I project you're going to end up with. If we go down another way, here are the possibilities. So, like, tell me what I've advised you the outcomes and the pros and cons of each. And
Make the choice.
Yeah, make the choice, man. At the end of the day, you are paying me to do what you want me to do. And if it's unfeasible, then I won't.
There's an awful lot of doctors they'll give you the blood pressure medicine, and they'll give you the insulin, and they'll give you all the pharmaceutical remedies that don't actually fix anything, right? They treat symptoms most of the time. There's not as many of those people that are going to say like, well, what you need to do is lose 30 pounds, stop eating so much fucking sugar, right? And like maybe like get on an exercise bike once in a while. And I think that is a distinction between, a good doctor and a not so good doctor, and a good dog trainer and a not so good dog trainer.
Yeah, I think dog trainer is a broad term, and I liked it that you drew the distinction between being a good dog trainer and a good instructor of clients. And you have, this is something I've long, I don't, my podcast really is exists for me to kind of look in a mirror and think about what I would like to be and work towards that. But I suck at and I hate objective standards. But I recognize their value. And so, and one thing I said in that last podcast you mentioned was that I'm always surprised at the end of my class how well all my dogs have done. Because I have a blind spot for incremental progress, and I recognize it. And so what it means is I have to go in and put the time in every day, feeling like I'm spinning my wheels, feeling like I'm going nowhere. I'm like my own clients in that regard. I know that it's going to work out because it just has over and over again.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure why I deserve it to, other than I go and do the work. And so I think there is if there's anything to be taken away from this particular conversation, is that that's normal. Is we the objectively measuring progress is important, and that is an important part of being a professional. Um, an important part of being a good client is not just going home and doing your homework, not just being motivated and not caring, but buying into the fact that when you're doing the work, it's not going to feel good and it's not going to feel like you're making progress, and doing it anyway and continuing to do it over and over again until you're ready to test to an objective standard, fail and start over and try again, or succeed and move on past beyond that milestone. And that's what everything is. And in dog training, it's just doing it to the point where you've earned the ability to intuit it.
Well, it's funny that you went there because as soon as you talked about that moment in the podcast, that's what struck me is your genuine expression of surprise. Of you went out there and it's like I'm working the dog and I look up and it's like, oh, you're doing a lot of good stuff. How'd we get here? And I just over time every day. And it's funny because I know you. I've gotten to know you pretty well over the past few years. And earlier on, it's funny how often myself and I would hear other people ask you, "How do you do X, Y, and Z?" And you're like, "Man, I don't know. I go out there and I train dogs, right?" And it's like I don't really know what I'm doing with that dog until I'm with that dog. And it's interesting because like I can relate to that in a lot of ways to where you really don't know how far you've come until it's just like you're a month or 2 into it, and it's just like, "Man, we have really come a long way here just by showing up every day and just kinda 5, 10 minutes a day." It's like it's amazing how at the beginning, it feels like we have so far to go, and then by the end, it's like, "Man, we've come a long way by doing very little."
That, and I'm also so envious of Nate and what he's described in regards to codifying it and saying, I mean, because that's my thought process every day. And one thing, like for me, it's always extremely anxiety producing, like my 3 to 5 days before turnover, because I'm like, I can't, I have not set a standard for myself to meet. I've just gone to work every day and done it. And I'm like, so like turnover day is like test day for me every time. I know how it's going to work. I mean, the dogs show up, they do fine, but it's never done when you're dealing in bird dogs,
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And 6 weeks is not nearly, and it's not, what I'm trying to accomplish is to show you, number one, and we touched on this early in Randall, I like starting with the fallout. Like, it's, uh, I have to set your expectations. I have to help you set your own expectations. I have to be a part of managing those. Like, I need you to understand what it is that you really want out of this before we get started. And and sometimes, I spend people end up and this is another thing that's always surprising to me is I always feel like I'm trying to talk people out of training when they start. And then it ends up talking them into it more, right? But it's, you're entering, you're not bringing a raw product to me for me to turn a wrench on and hand back to you as a finished product. We're entering into this kind of contract where we're going to have a relationship. And if all goes well, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, you and I will still be in regular communication. And it's mostly going to be you sending me pictures of you and your dog with a grouse on the tailgate and me going, hell yeah, and sending thumbs up emojis, hopefully. Um, but it doesn't happen in 6 weeks. But what I have to offer you is a good, hard, honest effort of giving your dog a foundational structure and some tools to move forward with, and then hopefully you. And that's what I'm still feeling like I'm learning to do. Because what I'm learning now and what I've been kind of my journey over the last couple of years is understanding how important it is for me to impart mechanical skills on my clients, not just this understanding of basic principles. And so I have to be more structured and rigid in the way I deal with my clients and saying, hey, you got to drill. You got to do this over and over and over again until you get good at it and you don't have to think about the way you move your hand and your feet anymore.
I think the hardest part about the board and train kind of situations is that part of what you're developing with that dog is not just a skill set in them, but it's a relationship with them, right? And that's kind of a byproduct of the amount of time that you're spending with that dog. And you see some parents do the same thing with their kids. Like, you can't outsource that relationship. And so even when you turn that dog back over and now you've taught them all sorts of stuff, like the owner doesn't get credit for that, for the
Yeah.
time you spent with that dog. Like, you can teach them how to operate it, but that's the difference between you're saying turning a wrench and this is a living thing, is that that dog has a relationship with you that needs to be worked on with the owner.
100%. But it's like I said in that podcast, it's the only thing in my life I've been able to. And there's been plenty of objectives I've met. This is just the one that's ongoing. It never ends. It's just every day of my life looks the same with the dogs. And if it didn't, I would feel completely out of sorts. I think that's why, as a trainer, I prefer board and trains. I love training my clients or instructing my clients, but I really struggle, especially with my bird dog work, which is what most people tend to come to me for, is bird work. Um, and I can I've talked about this a lot, but I like to train in the West Gibbon style. And that's fun to me. It's a fun process. I don't think that I'm making a wild bird dog while I'm doing it. It's hard to measure your objective standards in that process, as a matter of fact. Like, it's hard to know when you have a broke dog if you're in West Gibbons. You have a broke dog when the dog's broke, and it's only broke when it's ready to be broke, and you only start breaking it when it's ready to be starting, to start being broke out. And it could completely rely on a check cord and a pinch collar and some carded pigeons. Um, and there's a lot of information being passed through that leash and that pinch collar that are tough to articulate to people. And so when I give those kind of lessons, most of my time is spent with other people's dogs in my hands and not drilling them through the mechanics. But those are tough mechanics to drill, and it's something that I think if we could, or I could figure out how to help people understand. But to be honest with you, I say I train in the West Gibbon style because I always want to give that a nod and acknowledge it. Um, but I read it, I asked questions about it, and then I had to figure it out on my own.
Right.
You know,
You put your own flavor onto it for sure. And Wes Gibbons, that's one that I know Randall, you and I have trained together. You've been intrigued by it. Nate, you and I have had a number of discussions when it comes to the Wes Gibbons. It's like you have different steps, but to your point, there's not like a real clear objective measurement of like, oh, you're done with this step. Now move on to the next one. Now move on to the next one.
I think that you can write it on paper as if there are clear objective steps, but I think feeling it is a different thing.
But I think that's true with all training, and
Sure.
that's where, like, when we talk about chunking, it's kind of the thing that I try to talk to clients about all the time is, if this is step one and this is step two, your dog might need a step 1.5. And
Sure.
some dogs need a step 1.25, 1.5, 1 3/4, right, to get to two. And that you always have the opportunity to kind of break that stuff down a little bit more. And then when you're talking about you're in like your generalization or your proofing phases of training, then you're bringing in other elements where you just try to warn people that, hey, all this thing that you built that you're so proud of, like now it's gonna go to shit on purpose, like, and
Yeah.
that's the point, right?
Yeah.
Is that we have to challenge that against things, and it will fall apart. And so I think again, because I'm really into teaching the people, then I I guess I have a bias towards trying to add more structure to it and to kind of create more of a step by step thing. And I when I say that, I fight really hard to not have it come out as a recipe still, right? Like it's like trying to I want to I want to share the process and the process of the decision making rather than sharing steps.
Yeah, I love that. I love that wording. I love sharing the process of the decision making, because I think that's it, and that's the hard. Just trying to consider in my own mind what is my own process. Like, it's constant struggle for me. I mean, I do a lot of things impulsively in training,
Hmm.
that are reactions to a reaction to a reaction, um, and somewhere along the line, there's a way to explain that, but I sometimes struggle putting that together.
I was talking to, I don't remember if it was a conversation I had directly with Bart or it was at a seminar or a school that I went to with him, but he would talk about having, for a period of time, unconscious competence, right? Like he was competent in his ability to train a dog, but it was unconscious. He wasn't
Yes.
really, he wasn't thinking through all that. And so then, he had some success and then he gets invited to teach all these seminars. And then he's like, no problem. I know I can train a dog. So I'll teach you how to train a dog. He says he goes there. He tells them everything that he knows about dog training. It's only been 20 minutes. He's there for a 2-day weekend. And
Yes.
then he went, oh no, right? I have to become consciously competent, right? I have to be able to articulate all of the things that I am trying to do. And for me, one of the things that I try to really hard to do is I don't take leashes from people anymore
Yeah.
because it forces me to have to talk my way through something that it would be easier even if I had them hold half the leash and me hold half the leash. And I still do that sometimes and kind of try to show them like timing of releasing pressure, application, or like how to do a correction, like those sorts of things. But as much as I can help it now, I try to sit down and talk them through that stuff.
I love that, and I think Bart is a true sage. Like, I've always been impressed by what he does. There was one clip of an interview he did at a European test of some sort where somebody was interviewing. Did you ever see the bit where he talks about the stick?
Mm-hmm.
And so he talks about a mentor of his talking about using a stick. He can use the stick to motivate the dog to action. He can use the stick to stroke the dog and to give tactile comfort to the dog, and then he can at the end toss the stick and have the dog bring the stick back to him, and that it's not the tool, it's the intent, and that struck a real chord with me, and from that moment on, I paid a whole lot of attention to Bart. Um, I think, and I would love to only leave the leash in my client's hands. I don't have the ability to articulate how to get from point A to point B,
Mm-hmm.
which is when I put a pinch collar on a dog, I need the dog forward of me. I want
God, I'm so excited we're having this talk right now. I was just talking to him. I had so many questions.
it's,
This is going to be 4 hours. I hope you're ready. Buckle up, bud.
I give you when I have a check cord and a pinch collar, the dog must be willing to give me back pressure,
Mm-hmm.
but it also must respect the lead. And so we're doing a dance where you're questing, but I'm able to feed you very small bits of information in a tactile way that say, I'm going this way, you need to come with me. So I'm giving you some nonverbal stuff with my body. I'm giving you some tactile stuff with the lead and the pinch collar. And then sometimes I'm going to tug on that pinch collar and it's going to predict the flush of a bird. Sometimes I'm going to tug on that pinch collar and it's going to mean move in this direction with me. And it only comes down to my intent. I can't, and I've tried. What am I maybe doing? The dog always must have a forward posture. Shouldn't look at me. It should be consumed with what's ahead and the potential for action in the game. And I know that there is an explanation for what's happening mechanically. I haven't quite been able to put a finger on it. And that's just describing going afield. Like take out the starting stop to flush or starting asking the dog to stop and stand, putting hands on the dog, and all those things that come with that West Given style. And just ask you to be willing to take the slack out of the lead, but not drag me. But also don't take too much slack out of the lead and stay forward. And don't think of this as obedience. Think of this only as you and I going afield as partners. And I'm sure there's very, an explanation for all of that stuff, but there's also something that's a bit woo about it still yet, to me at least.
Yeah.
And I enjoy doing that. And so for that reason, I have yet to kind of get to that place. But what I would really like to do is have a class where I hand you a pinch collar and you a check cord, and that goes on your dog, and I shut the heck up. and you go afield, and I only tell you when you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Otherwise, figure out how to do it right.
Nick and I were talking about this earlier today. Actually, a lot about what you were just saying, and so your explanation was already helpful. I think for me, what I said to Nick earlier today was, I don't know if I have a frame, like my way of thinking about dog training, like my mental model for dog training doesn't allow what you just said to fit nicely in it. And so because of that, do I need to throw out the frame I have and then be able to kind of like just take this information as its own? Or do I try to make what you just said fit in the way I already think about stuff? Because the value of having a certain amount of experience now is you can go most places and sit down with most competent trainers and they can teach you something new and you can integrate that very quickly into what you're doing, right? Most things I feel like you can gather it conceptually, like because I have a decent amount of wild bird hunting experience now. The little bit of information that you gave me today, I found birds, and like I found, like exactly where you said they were going to be. You're like, they're in this kind of cover, and then within that kind of cover specifically, you should look for these certain things, and they just tend to like that stuff. And that was every contact I had today, right? So like, and I can synthesize that with what I already know and with what I already know about reading my dog while I'm watching her work, and then we can use that quickly. But I have trouble with everything you were just explaining, because to me, what you talked about sounding artful, and you said, like, you said it sounds a little woo woo, right? But it's like it sounds very artful to me, but what it also sounds like is a little bit unclear signaling to the dog.
It's very unclear signaling.
Yeah.
Like the dog has to, the dog actually has to, in my opinion, be the one to bring the clarity into the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because I'm leaving everything to the dog. You got to decide what's enough back pressure. Like I mean, at the end of the day, it's as simple as I'll post up. Some dogs are going to arch that back and dig.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give them a lot of feedback and tell them that's inappropriate. then I also have to convince the dog that it's still appropriate to take all that slack out of the line, just not that much.
Yeah.
That's a without um without precise signaling.
Mhm.
Like you have to be the one that determines that. And when I say you, I mean the dog. You have to be the one that determines what's enough. Because some dogs will give me take a little more slack. Some will give me a little more. Some will keep an entire slack line, but stay questing.
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong as long as you're forward and your mind is forward, and your intent is forward. And I'm there as an observer, but also as somebody that may intervene when the time is right, but not the one teaching you or telling you what to do. Does that make sense? It's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Like because at the end of the day, all I'm doing is facilitating the interaction you're having with the bird.
Okay.
In a perfect world, you come across a scent cone at a 90-degree angle, and you make odor recognition, and I launch, and then I may drop the cord and let you chase. I there are there's a dog in my most recent class where I never dropped the cord, and not only did I restrain chase, I started um, somewhat correcting chase immediately on the check cord, which is way outside of my normal practice.
Okay.
But it just depends on your willingness to engage the bird. It would be easy to call it drive, but like this dog outside of drive had like a relatively mild temperament.
Mm-hmm.
But when it came into drive, it was an absolute maniac.
And so your decision to uh not allow chase with that dog was like, can you give me something
Yeah, so
specific to point to on why you made that choice?
So before I ever go take a dog afield on a pinch collar, I'm going to take it afield on a flat collar, and there's going to be birds. So first, we're going to start. You're going to drag a check cord through this area, and there's going to be birds. And you're going to bump and chase, or you're going to catch, or you're going to do whatever. But I'm never going to step into that area if you don't have the history of bird contact in that field. And so once you do, now automatically I've got you in a higher state of arousal when I walk into the field, like when I step out the door. And so with some dogs, I've got to just stand there for the first 3 sessions and say, hey, you got to respect the equipment. But once you respect the equipment, now I want you to go forward independently without signal. Don't look to me for any signaling. Just stay out forward. Okay, here's a contact. How do you handle it? And then we do that over and over again until the dog shows me how they're going to handle it, and then I react accordingly.
So what did that dog do in his handling of a bird to make you decide kind of really early on, hey, I'm not going to let this dog chase any birds?
So she had plenty of chases prior.
Okay.
To the point where I started handling her on the check cord. She never established a point. So there were a lot of crosswind contacts with pop birds from a launcher, or crosswind contacts, and I even a few times just threw a quail down just so I could make sure that we weren't dealing with some sort of outlying thing with the launcher and a pigeon. Quail, dig in, and at some point you have to decide whether you're going to let the dog catch or make full contact flush or whatever. And so I'm not big on restraining. I don't like back pressure leaning into a bird, but I'll do it if I just need to control satiation in the moment. And so from there, yeah, for her, like she never needed chase. Yeah, I need to know you have the desire to hunt and to make game, to contact game, to chase, flush, catch, whatever, before I start asking you to restrain yourself in any way. And because if I had wild birds, I wouldn't have to worry about that so much. But I don't. And so in order for me to tell you, you're not allowed to, so you can do whatever you choose to do on initial contact with that bird, because what I need to do is ask you to lean on your instinct to point the bird.
Mm-hmm.
And if that means removing some of the chase to show you that there's no incentive to flush that bird, because I believe that there's an enormous um, reinforcing effect of a chase
Yeah.
outside of just satisfying that with a catch and retrieve or a catch and ingestion or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I remove some of that chase, I'm removing some of your incentive to flush. So with all that said, this dog never, like, she showed me very early that I did not need to build any of that into her.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to just see her just give me a flashpoint. And so in order to get there, we just rode it into a bunch of birds, and I just said, I'll restrain that chase. And that I'll restrain that chase turned into, I'm going to allow you some check cord, and I'm going to offset myself in such a way that I spin and disorient you, which is a big part of kind of Wes Gibbons stuff, like the spin thing.
Yeah.
It's just disorient, and so what you're doing is you're taking the shock, the impact out of the end of the line. So I don't want the correction of the pain of you hitting the end of the line hard and me turning you over or whatever. So I offset, I let your own momentum carry you in a bit of a circle.
Yep.
And then you're standing still at the end, and you can choose to keep a forward orientation.
Yeah.
And if you choose to keep that forward orientation and stay standing and pay attention, then I can maybe capture that moment.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's, to me, is what the spin is. And so we spun her 1,500 times in the course of that class, right? And she, at the end, she left pointing a launcher, thinking about pointing a quail a couple of times. But I guess that's that process downwind of a bird. And then on top of that, we put a lot of just, hey, basic control. But the pinch collar is a really interesting implement because it allows for a lot of back pressure without a lot of discomfort.
Yeah.
But the ability to give tactile feedback because of the rivets, so there is some pain involved or some feedback involved. But it, obviously if I was out there with a prong collar, it'd be a completely different game. Now we're dealing in levels of pain that aren't going to incentivize a forward thought process or forward action.
Right.
So, yeah, I think there is a way. I certainly think that this can be explained with the language we have available.
Yeah.
That being said, I haven't tried too hard to do that.
Well, so like when I'm trying to think through this, and I would like if I'm trying to explain it to myself in the words that I would use. To me, it sounds like you're using negative punishment of the bird flying away.
Yes.
Right. And then we're
course.
stopping the chase because the chase is part of that reward.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so if you're just restraining the dog, literally just stopping them from chasing, there's no positive punishment element there early on necessarily. Right.
No, but back pressure plays a big role. Right. Like, so potentially there's positive punishment because, you should, you're out. If you felt comfortable enough to either keep digging in or chase, then you would continue to do that.
Right.
So I'm disincentivizing that somehow.
Right.
With some level of discomfort, but not enough to stop your forward orientation.
Sure. But then at some point your step after that is that dog, when that bird flushes and that dog starts moving in that direction, you moving to the side, right? So that you're getting that spin the way that you talked about it. To me, that seems more like positive punishment, because a key element of positive punishment to me is the dog's loss of environmental control.
Yes.
Right. So like, it's not, if the dog believes that they have a way to get back to good, it wasn't positive punishment. Like that needs to be like, that's the end of this repetition. Right. And like, there's no way for you to recover this now. Right. On that repetition is kind of the way that I think about.
It's an interesting, that adds a new element to positive punishment for me, and I like it. I don't disagree. Yeah, I think for sure there's a punishing effect. Like, I've got to be, I'm disincentivizing something.
Yeah.
I'm hoping to make something less likely to occur in the future. It's just while I'm making the chase less the flush or the chase less likely to occur in the future, the real objective is to make you want to leave the bird on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so because if I'm dealing in a dog whose desire to flush or capture or do whatever overrides their instinct to point, I'm tapering back on these incentives
Yeah.
to try and allow that thing to come out with just a little more fervor.
So do you feel like the check cord is the thing that's making the dog want to keep the bird on the ground, or is the bird leaving like I guess if I'm framing this in an operant way,
Yeah,
right? Then like which
both.
okay.
100%. Like I don't, I'm also a big believer that I can't exist in one quadrant 100% of the, like 100%, even if I want to, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I've always
Mhm.
kind of believed that if I'm dealing in positive punishment, then somehow I'm dealing in negative reinforcement to some degree and vice versa. Like, I mean, and now I can get clean with it.
Mhm.
I can get really clean with it, but usually when I'm punishing, say, the act of, uh, when I'm punishing the act of getting something out of the trash can, I'm somehow also negatively reinforcing the act of just getting your head out of the fucking trash can, stinking trash can.
I
Pardon
guess
my
for
language.
me the the reason why I have trouble framing it that way is I think of positive punishment. You're doing one thing
Hmm.
and then that stops, and I don't care what you do after that. You could enter into any behavior
Sure.
other than that one, and with negative reinforcement you could be doing any behavior, and then when pressure is applied you do one thing.
Yes. So if I'm using negative reinforcement, like if I have a clear objective, so I agree with what you're saying. So if my objective is to use negative reinforcement to build a very specific behavior, then I don't care about what
No
I'm.
one's going to listen to this.
I don't care about
I will 17 more times, but nobody
all
else
the
will.
other things I may be punishing
Yeah.
while I'm doing that. But the fact is, they're still occurring, and so I try to be aware of that. Like what behaviors may I be punishing while I'm negatively reinforcing a specific behavior,
Yeah.
and are any of those disadvantageous?
Yeah.
But do you
Right.
ever try, so like the punishment for the dog not establishing point when you get him into odor, realizing that you're in back pressure, which could be perceived by the dog as negative reinforcement to move forward. Instead of negative punishment of sending the bird, do you ever apply positive punishment first after you've kind of vetted that the negative punishment won't work?
Never in the presence of the bird, never in presence of odor.
Okay.
So I would never see myself as punishing the act of not establishing point.
See, I'm on the flip side. I will.
Yeah, well, I mean, now I have, but
Yeah.
in this particular scenario, I don't.
Yeah.
Like what I'm trying to do is to disincentivize everything else
Yeah.
besides the act of pointing and allow you to point.
Nate, this touches on exactly what we were talking about on the West method earlier, the ambiguity almost of the pressure on the check cord. And it comes down to like finesse. And when we talk about communication, when it comes down to trying to communicate to the average person, I find it interesting that both of you in this conversation, and I know Randall by extension, and myself, we always come at it from how are we communicating to the people and or the dogs. But sometimes just as important, if not more important, is the receiving party. Are they receptive and in a position to actually take in what we're communicating to them? And I think it's just as important whether you're dealing with dogs or people. And Grayson, we've talked about this to where a lot of the stuff that we're talking about right here, right now, that a lot of people might be banging their heads against the window or something in the truck saying, what's all this negative punishment, negative reinforcement stuff. I I think it's important to realize that Grayson, if you go all the way back to the very start of this podcast, I think it was like episode 6 or 7 or something like that. You were saying all of this stuff to me. I was not in a position to receive it or digest it. And so when it comes down to a communication factor, I find it interesting how we can all sit here and talk about I need to be better at communicating it. I need to be, and that's true and we should be striving to be better communicators. But also there's an element of this that sometimes the people just aren't open to receiving the message. And then in this example of the dogs on the check cord you were talking about earlier today, I was explaining what to look for in the habitat and where to find birds. But if you would have asked me to communicate that to you without standing out there in the woods and explaining to you what witch hazel looks like without a visual representation, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And so when you're talking, Grayson, about picking up the leash and being able to actually do it, and I can't communicate it, I don't think that that's necessarily a fault in your communication skills. I think there's some things that you just have to be able to actually do in the moment to show and express that to whoever the receiving audience is, dog or person.
And I've always said force fetch is an experiential process. Like it's very easily described. Like it is to me. I love it because it's something that there's a start point, there's an end point. Every step in between is easy to describe. There's an easy milestone to overcome. Yet, unless you've done it, it's hard, and
Yeah.
it's you know,
Yeah.
and it's not intuitive, and so I think some things are experiential in life, and not to say that they can't be explained. This one is a little tougher when we talk about the West Gibbons stuff, and like, because sometimes the objectives are different. Like the bitch I was describing earlier, like I was just trying to get her to sustain a point. Um, that's not normally my objective. Usually, that's pretty easy to accomplish with most dogs that have like a modicum of pointing instinct that it doesn't isn't overridden by their desire to kill everything on the ground. You
Yeah.
know,
But it's interesting to where, like, even if you go into these little small niches within the space,
yeah.
what be it whatever method, and this example is the West Gibbons and the Westies, as they're uh, referred to. It's like it's interesting when we're talking about a method that hinges upon the bird teaching the dog in the truest sense of the yeah, we're hitting the launcher button, but the bird technically
What?
is what's stopping the dog. And we just talked about, are we cueing the dog, are we correcting the point, all this stuff. And it honestly, like, if you go into the little subsection of the dog training space in the Westies, it's like we've all been to seminars where somebody's explaining it a completely different way,
Sure.
and people within their own corner can't even agree on that. And that's like that's the most important thing of the entire method, in my opinion.
But I think it's really important that I always draw the distinction that I don't consider myself a Westie.
Right.
Like I always say that like I'm heavily influenced by it. I like to acknowledge it because I everything I do I took from people that practice in that method. I think it's unfair for me to say that I practice that method because I have had to do it without mentorship. Like I didn't get the experiential process of having somebody walk me through with the lead and show me exactly what they do. I had to read, I had to ask questions, I had to pay attention. But at the end of the day, I feel like I took a ton of stuff from that, and whatever I'm doing, somebody that practices the West method is taught by Bill West, and maybe their protege could look at what I do today and go, he's screwing it all up. He's not doing it right. But what I took from that, and what I think is a really fundamental piece of the way I think about training bird dogs, is that the moment I influence a dog on point to stop and stand still, that dog is no longer on point. And what point is could we could get way outside the lines on all this, but I'll see dogs that are self-relocating, and I would much rather have that dog self-relocate in that moment than to influence it to stop. And I have to allow for certain things to occur. And so what I want is for the bird to be holding the dog in position. Now there are things that I will do to influence that could maybe be considered influencing what's happening in there, but to me it's indirectly. And so I would never directly influence a dog on point to not move. And if I'm doing that, then I'm crossing a line that I don't want to cross. Now, that being said, I've done it. I just recognize it's like, uh, it's like an addict acknowledging they have a problem. There's times where I'm going to step in there and influence it, but I also know that that dog is no longer on point. That's just me stopping it, and hopefully, I have some sort of knock-on effect that holds over.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, depending on, I'd say probably all of the hunt tests and back to the objective measures, the dog's point ends when it becomes cognizant of the handler. Like when they become aware of the handler, technically that's when the point ends and you enter into steadiness, which is obedience rather than pointing. Depending on how much you want to buy into that, I'm just saying that kind of goes into
That's
what
the
you're saying.
NAVTA definition, but I think it's still pointing if the dog is holding the bird on the
I agree,
ground.
100%. So, like for me, I don't like that definition. Like, I as long as the bird is holding the dog in position, then no matter what. So a part of my proofing process is injecting myself into the situation and not having an impact. So I'll come in, make noise, I'll do things, I begin to touch the dog, and
Yeah.
at some point, if I've got the right kind of dog, I'm going and picking them up by the tail and spinning their butt around in front of their face, and they're not ever dipping an ear or flinching. They're solely focused on that bird because everything I'm doing is just getting in their way, and they're here and they don't want me there. And that's that the way. If I'm in a trial and I walk in on my dog, I want him to staunch up because he's going, "Don't screw this up for me, dude." Not because he's worried about me, right?
I have so many. Man, I'm gonna have to chew on this for a long time. I just so like we talked about a couple things, and one of the things that you were when you were talking, saying back to me what I had said to you about describing certain stuff in the environment we're hunting in. It's one of the things that I say to my clients all the time is like you can't explain things to the dog. I mean verbally,
Yeah.
right? And so the dog has to experience things and then experience like how their interaction with the environment created an outcome, and then they can make an informed choice, a more informed choice in the future. So the thing that I'm having trouble with is like in all these situations, what is the dog picking up on that's informing their decision? And so like there's got to be some other context or something, you know, visual or something they smell or something they hear, right? Or whatever the case may be that is happening in conjunction with you giving them a pop on the check cord that you said earlier could mean a bunch of different things, but at some point if they're coming to understand what you meant when your feedback was effectively the same, then that means there's got to be some other thing that's happening that's given them that like context clue.
So with the pop on the check cord,
Hmm.
so the information I'm specifically feeding the dog is like the first thing I want it to mean is this predicts the flush of a bird. Now, there's a time where I'm going to teach you
Why do you want that?
because I want you to have intensity, right? So you're restrained. You can't move. If you believe you shouldn't move, and you're willing to restrain yourself. So hopefully, at first, the first time I do it, like we've come in and I've flushed a bird, I've restrained you, and I've asked you to stand still. I flushed a bird, I've restrained you, I've asked you to stand still. Like there may be some feedback on the collar, but there's nothing succinct. There's nothing that says,
Yeah.
nope, stop. Because another thing, fundamentally, I believe stop and motion is much more important than duration and standing. Right. And so I want to see a really hard stop and motion before I ever care about the way you look while you're standing and standing with duration.
Hmm.
When your intensity will come because you're in the bird field and you're engaged in a forward way. So that's number like as long as you're there and I've restrained you and I've taught you you should stop in motion. And if you continue to move, I will ask for duration and you're willing to stop and stand, but you're not worried about me because I've done it in such a way that I'm not over influencing you. I'm not taking you out of the context. Um, then I can come in and you've already experienced flushes. You've already experienced not desiring to move forward because there's a consequence for it
Mm-hmm.
after the flush. Now I can predict the flush. Now I can say, we're cruising, tug flush, and the flush occurs, and you already have a history of restraining yourself and stopping and watching the bird away because it's better than the alternative of trying to chase the bird that you never smelled in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
We're dealing in a different state of mind because you don't have a nose full of bird.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have quite as much arousal, and to me, it's a different behavior. Like, it's not pointing, right? You're just stopping and standing and watching a bird away. And so now we do that enough times, and I go tug, and you go, oh, where's the bird? Now I've created a history of stopping hard. I've got not only a stop in motion, but a stop in motion that's not just disciplinary. It predicts something that's somewhat reinforcing.
Yeah, so that's in our system. That's how we would prepare any application of pressure, right?
Yes.
As to be a predictor of reward.
It's a very Nepopo-ish approach to stop. But the thing is, it's a Nepopo-ish thing, but it's a bit of popo-knee because we're starting with the stop in action, the stop in motion.
Uh-huh.
And in my opinion, I can't negatively reinforce an inaction. I've got to punish your action. So there's like a subtle punishment that comes with stopping.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, but there's some negative punishment and somewhat of a loss of a bird. Hopefully the loss of the bird, once a bird flushes, I mean, because at the end of the day, we should all be able to walk out with our bird dog, throw a pigeon, and they stop and watch it away.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, why are they doing that? Are they doing it because there's a consequence for continuing to move? Are they doing it because they're anticipating another flush? If they do step, because I do that a lot, there's always a second or third bird available. If you take a step, boom, you lose another bird. Or is it just the premac of, if you do it right, there's an option for something beyond this?
Mm-hmm.
You know? And so, but in my opinion, because I've taught you to respect the lead, because I've restrained you on the loss of that first pigeon, I'm not teaching you an action, I'm teaching you an inaction. There's a popo nay.
Okay.
Or a po. And maybe a nay, but it's not the same nay. I mean, like, but all those things, all the principles are still at play. It's just things are happening very, in a way that's maybe less clear, like you said earlier. I mean, it's not a clear signal because I'm not asking the dog to engage me and sit.
Do you feel like some of maybe the what I perceive as vagueness in the way that you're giving feedback or instruction to the dog through the check cord and the pinch collar is because your intent there is to, like, at some point the dog needs to kind of give themselves over to you a little bit in that work, and so, like, there's a even though you want them forward, that they're cooperating with you, and that they're really having to work to kind of figure out what you want.
I think it's less about what I want and more about what the environment will provide. Like, so the way I think about a check cord is less about me. It's less about, I mean, obviously I'm giving the dog feed. We're in a feedback loop. But there's a real important role that the check cord and the pinch collar play, which is just controlling the environment. Right? And so the environment's not going to allow you to chase. Your environment is here. Like, and we're establishing a level of control. It's less about my influence, and maybe even I would prefer the dog see me as somewhat of a hindrance, but one that must be dealt with. Like, because it's we're teaching these dogs to operate completely independently of us at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So the less influence I can impart early, the better off I am. Like, I'm really hopefully tricking the dog into believing I'm not influencing it, but that the environment is what it is. And there are certain things that I will disallow, but I really, really don't want you to take it personally.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to just think of what is it that, what can you do to get what you want out of this situation? How can you shed me a little more the next time around? and hopefully you learn to have an appropriate interaction with this bird that carries over to other birds when you and I are not connected by a tether.
Mhm.
And then I tend to employ much more e-collar than your average West Gibbons person. Later on, that's getting into the chase stuff, but I still want as much or as little personal effect of any correction as I can possibly have. Now, there's times where I will intervene. If I get a crazy ass dog and I say, okay, now the moment I step in and I ask for obedience, now we're into obedience land. And the moment you're willful and disobedient, now we've gone from being in a bird setup to being in an obedience setup.
Mhm.
And we'll change the dynamic immediately right there. But if I can keep as little influence on the whole deal as possible and you start to act a certain way autonomously, then I've done what I came to do.
Mhm.
This is interesting because I'm opposite from you on a lot of things, and I think pointing is obedience, right? Because coming from a detection background and you as well, obedience to odor is a real thing,
It's an indication, right?
right? The one stimulus brings on the behavior.
Well, here's my thing, right? It's like if we talk about operant conditioning, and we're going to use the definition that I'm going to use for that is it's spontaneous behavior, or another way to say that is it's elicited behavior. The dog just does a thing, right? They fuck around and then they find out, right? So like they try something and then they receive some sort of result, and at that point, now my behavior is not really elicited anymore, right? Now it's discriminate because now I know there's a thing that happens afterwards. So the first time it happened accidentally, kind of,
Yep.
right? And so for me, pointing starts out as elicited behavior, but it becomes discriminate.
This is why
Right.
I like incidental contacts
Yeah.
for my young dogs in the field. Right? That's elicited. It's you are in an environment. No matter how much of this I've done with you, when I take you out here and
You just discover that there's birds.
you just discovered that there's birds, and now hopefully, if I've put the cart before the horse, which I did with Van, hopefully there's a history enough of interactions that are similar to this thing that they bleed into that thing.
Yeah.
And if they're not, then we go back and we deal with it at home.
Yeah.
But if I didn't, then we come do this. You have all this history of truly operant interactions with birds.
Yeah.
And now I get to come home and say, well, obviously we don't have wild birds anymore, but here's some things you can do better the next time around, only because I'm affecting the environment. One thing I believe wholeheartedly as dog trainers is like, if we think of if we think of operant and we define the word and we talk about behavior, it's the organism's interaction with the environment. And so when we inject ourselves, we're not training the dog. We're affecting the environment. The dog's interacting with the environment, and it's we're affecting the feedback they get. So we have some manipulative effect, but at the end of the day, it's not a direct pathway. And so that's, to me, is the way I try to think of this, and I allow that to get more broad with the bird work. That's all I'm trying to accomplish.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I like that, and I think that there's applications to that outside of what we're talking about. Like it's one of the things I talk about a lot when I see, like a lot of trainers that would call themselves like behaviorists, or they say they do behavior modification and not obedience. And when I see a lot of the work that those folks do, is a lot of it is them injecting themselves into situations all the time, and then I'm kind of like, well, then your solution to this problem is always predicated on your presence, and then you don't really have a solution.
Yes.
Then, right? Like the dog should do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because you're there to influence or impact their behavior in that way. So I really like the way that you worded that. The other thing, Randall, I was thinking about was I've seen or I've listened to conversations in detection, and both of you guys have a background in this. So, like, people not maybe caring so much about having a trained final response, because if I can read my dog and I can see a change in behavior that lets me know that they are in odor, then unless there's a reason for me to need that, like I can't be having my dog scratch at explosives maybe, right? Or something like
aggressive
that.
alert.
Then
If we pick it,
yeah,
and we decide it's going to be the same one every time.
yeah,
Like if it's just about reading your dog and you go, okay, he twitched in here this time, but he spun an eyeball this way that time, then that's one thing. But if it's going, okay,
Well-
twitched his ear, so I'm going to pay. He twitched his ear, so I'm going to pay. Well, that's a trained fucking final response.
Yeah,
I know who you're talking about too. If I'm take a stab at it, but I like what that. If I'm thinking right, that person has to say about it. I don't disagree with him on a lot of the stuff, but a lot of the trained final response stuff is also case law. Like you gotta
Sure.
certain departments, certain agencies, like you have to have that.
yeah,
You can't just say, "Oh, I think," right? You have to be able to articulate it. And some departments can do that and be like,
Yeah.
"Hey, I saw this change of behavior. I read this. I called hot," and that's fine.
yeah.
And then like for me, where I worked, there's none of that. Like the only time that we would accept that is actually huge volume of odor, right? Because the dogs are imprinted on a very small amount.
Sure.
And then when you overload them with, say, a 1,500-pound charge in a car, they don't know where to final at. It's
Right.
so much odor they can't figure out where to
They're
sit.
like, it's here.
Yeah, they're
right?
just like
Yeah.
they go bananas and they're like, it's here somewhere. I just don't know like where is source because the whole
Yeah.
damn thing is source.
Yeah.
So that's why I still love this stuff, man, because it's art. Like there are still we can get sciencey about it, but like this is still art.
And when Grayson's talking about, he's using the check cord as a predictor for a flush because he wants intensity, right? And then I think you also said the intensity comes from the dog wanting to be forward. Like, to me, all of that is that there's a high amount of desire for the reward, right?
course.
That's there. So we would just say that dog has a lot of ignition, and that's needed to have them want to hunt in the first place, right? And then you were talking about, Randall, you said, teaching, maybe you didn't say teaching point, but you said pointing is obedience. And then we were saying pointing is elicited. And I feel like I've had experiences where it's both. And I think when everything goes right, and when you have like the green dog and it goes the way that's supposed to go, is most of that is, it's elicited by the dog's desire to keep the bird on the ground, and that comes about, and we extend it by using negative punishment, the bird flying away. But I have had dogs that people did a really good job turning them into a flusher when they're supposed to be a pointer.
Yeah.
We breed Munster later, so it's not like it's that hard to begin with. But in those cases, I made those dogs stop. And then I kind of made them watch either components of the rest of the sequence, or maybe I rewarded them in place at that time. And so we're able to, the point came about through training, through obedience, but we're able to still kind of backdoor that intensity because it's still all of that pressure that we're putting on the dog to force them to stop is predictive of them receiving a reward.
I mean, we just talked about how we could flow through the quadrants and touch all the quadrants in multiple reps. So, I agree. I think pointing is illicit for a small window of time.
Mhm.
And then after that, it's obedience, right? And that's just from my detection background. Like, I believe obedience to odor, right? The bird is the odor.
Yep.
So, is there some instinctual stuff in there? Yeah, but I think it's really just trained final response. And that's how I approach it. Right.
And
I can't wait for your first pointing Malinois.
Dude, I've thought about it.
Well, I mean, when you've had one, if you've had one that has a trained final response, right? I mean, it's, if we have a DFR as our trained final response,
what is a DFR?
Just a focused, it could be a down, it's a delayed or deferred final response.
Okay.
So it's not an aggressive alert.
Yeah.
Okay. Passive response.
It's a passive response, but we look for focus.
Sure.
Right? Because we want the indication of that specific thing. Then I would say that you have a trained point.
But that's where usually markers come in.
Markers could, or
right?
but I pay directly.
Yeah, you could
most times,
right.
And I can get a super clean DFR with a direct pay. I can also get it with a marker.
That's a whole nother podcast.
We can get those things. Here's the major difference, in my opinion, is I have control over the payment 100% of the time when I'm training a detection dog. I have zero control over the payment of a bird dog. And I don't control the environment. And the environment is going to do what it does. And the reinforcer is completely autonomous. And it decides when payment comes. And and what payment is. If unless I shoot the bird, and that's a completely, we're on in a completely different part of a sequence.
Hmm.
So to me personally, I want to see the dog and the bird have the interaction that creates the point. And so for me that starts with like the launcher. Um, if I'm teaching staunchness, it starts with with pin raised quail. If I got no access to wild birds, hopefully they're flashpoint in the pin raised quail. Like it makes life a lot easier if we get there at least. But if I what I'm looking for is you interact with the bird leaves, therefore it makes you more cautious next time you stop. Then I'm crossing a scent cone, you throw your nose, I launch a bird. All I'm looking for is a just noticeable difference, and I'll test it once. If you don't stop, then we do it over and over and over again. But I want you getting there, and the only time I have the opportunity to influence it is if I'm running a launcher. I don't have it if it's a released bird or a wild bird. And so for that reason, I think it, I can train it. I can train you to point that bird, but at that point, it's about me and not your interaction with the bird. Like, hey, and then we're just that like Althea makes game. She's got a little flashpoint to her, but the moment she makes game, I blow a sit whistle. She sits and she stares at the bird, and that that to me is a DFR on a bird, and I'm controlling everything beyond that.
It's just cool to see how everyone thinks about it a little bit differently. But still, I think the key point in all that is like we're all very thoughtful and have a lot of reason why we're doing or thinking certain ways or going about it the ways that we do versus just willy nilly or something like that.
I am interested though, like, because I don't do this, and I've often thought about it. Is like if I put more time and effort into really teaching whoa away from the field environment, how much impact could I have on point? Like, so if I put you on a barrel and just work the crap out of duration, if I taught you a really hard stop and stand, a really hard stop in motion, and then did a bunch of that stuff, and then did a ton of duration work, and then brought you into the field, you know, with how much impact would that have? And that's probably something worth exploring.
Yeah, I just for me, just what's been working really well is to have uh, different tools and different locations on the body communicate very specific things to the dog.
Yes.
So for me, having the dog on a flat collar and having them pull, like I like that. I use that on check cord. For me, when they hit scent cone, now I'm doing this when I know where the birds are, or most of the time. I know where the birds are most of the time. And so when I walk them into that scent cone, like I know where the bird is, but I don't know exactly when they're going to hit scent. So as soon as they cut that hard right angle, that line goes slack because they're making that movement and I'm always going to be late, right, at that point. So I know that I'm getting a point from them when that check cord goes slack there. And then after that, I can use that check cord to stop them if I need to, but I don't expect them to yield to it really
Yes.
at all because I really condition them to dig in hard
Yep.
against that. And if I needed to make a point, and I have done this, if I needed to make a point that they do need to stop and stand still, I could do that either with I'll say prong collar, not pinch collar, because that's usually what I'm using there. But what I've been doing a lot more is before we're doing that work in the field is conditioning a point of contact on the belly so that I have a way to stop them, basically do stop to flush at that point.
Yep.
And I taught that away from the field by stimming. You stand still and then you get paid, so that it's not, this means you lose something. I don't want my obedience to ever be me stopping the dog from getting what they want. I want the dog to believe this is a signal to do a thing that I am pretty much certain I'm going to get paid.
Because this is this, and I'm interested in this because
Mhm.
I like it. I think it makes sense. I love to use food with my own personal dogs, and play with it. I one place I struggle is like specific behaviors. What and this is what we're getting at. When am I punishing something and when am I reinforcing it? And I can pay duration and position,
Hmm.
and I can pay a stop in motion, but can I teach a stop in motion in a completely reward based scenario effectively that could be generalized, improved, like away from me?
But I don't like. It's not. Well,
It's not pressure free.
it's not pressure free.
I mean, I
No.
understand that, but like if I'm thinking in knee popo,
Yeah.
like when I think knee popo, I'm thinking
You're thinking of all
neg-
the shaping ahead of time.
well, I'm thinking negative, positive, positive, and so really, what even if we take all the shaping out,
Hmm.
and I've shaped a behavior ahead of time, like the predictor is constant pressure or pressure that induces action.
When I'm conditioning the belly collar, I usually try to do a couple things. The first thing is I'm gonna put the dog in a sit or a down, and then I'm going to use that point of contact,
To
and I want to
teach a
see them to
stand.
stand up.
That makes so much more
So
sense
there's
to me.
there is an action the dog can
Yes.
perform,
Yeah.
so that it can really function as negative reinforcement. And then
That.
when I'm paying them when they're stationary. So
Yes.
then when I take them out and let them run, and I hit them on the belly collar and they
Yeah.
stop out of motion, I come to them with a
Just
reward.
completely answered my question.
Okay, sweet.
Sorry, I didn't.
No,
Not to
no, it's
cut you
good.
off.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what I find interesting, Grayson, I don't know if you remember this, but last year coming up to the Northwoods, I was super excited with Quinn. It was like, all right, it's her first real growl season. Worked all this stop to flush, the West Gibbons. I did everything last year, and I got the remote stop. I never trained the verbal woe, but then when we got up to the Northwoods, there was a very clear disconnect between what you could do in the training field on stop to flush and birds flying and actual wild birds. And what I found was I had the remote stop, but because the flushes and the wild birds are so unpredictable, I'm not walking through the woods just holding my electronic, device to hit the collar. So my timing was always off. And I found that I could do it verbally much better than reaching in or reaching
Sure.
down and grabbing the remote collar, and then you're a second or two off. And so I literally went back, and because I had the remote stop, I mean, it was one, maybe two sessions, real quick, overlay the verbal, and it was a done deal. And it took, no joke, one bird. She bumped it, I woed her, and then, still got a tap on the collar. And from then on, she stood every single
I
bird.
would never argue that. Like I think there's plenty of value in a verbal cue
Hmm.
for such a thing. I just like number one. I think I want to build all my behaviors before I add a cue,
Right.
before I add my verbal command. Um, and then second, I think uh, the the more conservative I can be with that, the better. And so, like, that's the perfect environment to use it, right? But that being said, you're also talking about Quinn's first grouse contact,
Right.
and if that was me, I probably wouldn't. I would have let her rip, like, and just gone back and dealt with whatever at
Well,
home.
this was her first. So the year before, she had a couple
Gotcha.
grouse
Okay,
contacts,
gotcha.
chase, and all this stuff. So now we're at this point.
Yeah,
Last year she was, give or take, a year and a half. I think she was just under that. And it was just like, no, I need you standing your birds.
that's fair. Like, so if you're in season two, she has an understanding of at least what the game is,
Yeah.
then starting to ask for more and just I think verbal cue's fine as long as she's not having any sort of pressure response and
Mm-mm.
um
But remember talking to you after I got back from the trip, and I'm like, the whole idea of the method was, not that I had really any aversion to having a verbal woe, but it just seemed like, all right, like I did this. It was, and you don't really hear about like the disconnect on wild birds. You only hear like if you do this step, 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 your dog's just going to acknowledge all birds, all flying birds means stop to flush, essentially. Like, I know that's oversimplifying, but it goes to show that I think that there is another element to not just this method, but all of them is better explanation, that communication piece we were talking about, of explaining to people like, look, this will happen on training birds in the field, but when you go on wild birds and there is that random element of it and you don't control the environment, be ready to you might have to deviate from your typical protocol or process to really kind of connect the finished
Well,
dots on that.
there's more to it though, right? Like we come out to the training field and it's you and your training partner, or just you. The dog's probably watched you prep the equipment,
The
right? Or put
context,
the
yeah.
launchers out. You're wearing the same training belt, carrying the same training starter pistol. Like we change all of that when we come out here. They go on a 16-hour car ride. Now I'm wearing my vest. Now I'm carrying a different gun. Like all the contextual clues change, and then the
You
rate of
don't train with that
reinforcement.
fancy gun you got?
Huh?
You don't train with that fancy gun you got?
Absolutely not. We won't talk about that fancy gun. No, but like our rate of reinforcement gets drastically
Oh yeah.
out of whack, and the effort that the dog has to put in to
Find that.
find is way more.
Yeah.
So I think there's some frustration that comes in with all that stuff, and then all the contextual clues tell them this is a different game, and then add the odor picture on top of it, and then we don't control anything. Like it's a recipe, like you
But the
know.
more you hunt, the more I feel like the more it informs my training setups. Like
Yeah.
when I
Oh
started out,
yeah.
it was always birds in 6-inch tall grass,
Mhm.
right? And a launcher. I had them in the same spots, and then like I don't know how often birds ever are in that kind of cover,
Well,
right?
you know,
So
it's funny that you say that though, because like for me personally, like my entire training area is like 2 acres,
yeah,
and uh, I think of what I do as training concepts
yeah,
and not trying. Like that said, in the process we're talking about,
hmm
there's plenty of times where we go set birds in the field and we go work,
yeah,
and we're working on other things, and I have other tools and other abilities to train in those moments. But when I'm developing concepts, like birds can be in the same place. You're going to creep. You're going to do like I'm going to. I don't care that you think you're hunting or know you're hunting. I just want you to have this interaction right now in this moment and get a concept. I need to be staunch. I need to be steady to shot. I need to be steady to fall. I need to hear shots prior to the flush. I need to hear all these things. And then I'll leave that and generalize. But this is my acquisition area. So I do a ton of acquiring skills in this little area. And then we go screw it all up and piece it back together in other places. But I think there's a place for, yeah, I think, because I felt I had this same feeling when I first got into this. I was like, these guys plant the birds in the same spot every time. Well, it's like if you're anticipating a bird there and you're not cautious, well, now you're a little more cautious. Maybe, but now you're anticipating, now you're too cautious, and now I need to move my bird. But I'm thinking, you know, there's times where I'll set a bird in the same place 3, 4, 5 setups in a row. If I've got a dog that has zero caution, I may change my approach to that bird. Um, and sometimes if I set that same bird there and I've got a dog that has zero caution and they just want to drag me to that bird and have that same thing happen over and over again, I gotta drop back and punt from that. But there are times where these things, there's value in some of the things that feel too redundant, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Not always, but sometimes.
yeah.
But then there's times you got to step outside of that stuff and you got to go test that and see it fall apart and then decide where you need to step back to in training to reconceptualize or drive home what I've asked of you the first time.
I know one of the things that I do that's helped a lot. You've heard of it too. 10-8 problem in service, right? Surprise hides where the
And
dog
it's
would never expect,
what I
right?
would call the incidental.
Yeah, the incidental. So like, I'll put them behind truck tires. Like I'll put a bird behind, in random weird spot. I won't cue the dog. I won't say anything. If they miss it, they miss it. If they hit it, they hit it.
Oh, I like that.
Right? It's
Yeah,
just completely random. They would never think there's a bird there, but 10-8 in the cop world means in service, right? So when you check in, you go 10-8. So we're saying their nose is 10-8, it's in service, right? And I'm stealing this from the cop world, but like I'll do that a lot. I'll put a bird 10 meters off the truck and the dogs are heeling with me to get ready to go through our ritual to get ready to release in the field. And they're like, oh crap.
Yeah.
Like
Can an
there's a bird right
can
there.
an incidental find trigger? And this would be a big thing we would do, like in Afghanistan when we were in service. Like, the guys would go out and clean at the same time every day, and they'd like air their dogs, and we would set a find
On the way to the break yard.
Yeah, on the way to the break yard. And it's just like, and just watch the guys roll by. And nobody's in trouble if they didn't get it right or anything. And sometimes we would tell them, and sometimes we wouldn't, depending on the handler confidence, And many dogs would never hit that. But what we found is we could decrease that threshold for incidental contact.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I think this happens naturally when we hunt. Like our young dog is just like, oh, I'm out on air and walk, blah blah blah. What's that? And that's, and that happens once, and then the next time, no matter where you walk, you can be at the dog park the next time. That the neural pathway between the nose and that place in the brain that says, oh, engage work, gets tighter, sharper.
Yeah. Yeah.
The craziest thing that we noticed with that kind of stuff was watching. Not only could you grade the dog, you could grade the handler. Who can read their dog and who's going to pull them off odor thinking that they're disobedient.
Yeah.
Right? Because if the dog's truly obedient to odor.
Oh, I don't want to tell you how many times I called my dog off of like a mesquite bush with prickly pear in it in the Southwest because I'm like, there's going to be a snake or something under there that I don't want, right? And then until I saw one of those little fuckers come out from under that, and then I'm like, how many birds did I pull you off of?
Yep. That was a real eye opener for me.
Yeah.
Like that changed the way I think about bird
dogs.
That
was Jay for me. It was big on that, and he would, we got into like small odor and stuff, but a lot of buried finds all the time, and that would be the thing. We'd like bury something 6 inches deep, let it soak for an hour, and then just like turn dogs out on a normal airing break and just watch them and see. And you would see something. Then again, that word threshold gets tossed around a lot in the detection dog world, or dog world in general, and I think is overused. But this one, is a place where it makes sense. Where it's like, what's the how quick is the trigger, on the dog? And I think that's an enormous.
Do you guys run blanks? Like, will you put on all your equipment, act as if you're going to go train, literally to the T, and there's nothing out there?
Not in that acquisition phase, but definitely
in later training.
I mean, that happens when I hunt often.
Yeah. So if I step out in the field, there's a lot of times like luckily we have like keepered birds, so we'll do a big pheasant hunt or something like that, and I'll have Johnny houses out there, and most days I'll go turn birds out of the Johnny houses and roll when the cover's down. But some days I don't turn them out at all, and we go run. Sometimes I'll find a bird, sometimes they won't, but they should be, to me, one of my dogs should be able to start at my house and make it to the kennels and stay forward and stay excited to hunt with no find, and that's about a 30-minute run by foot.
I really only do that after a lot of stop to flush training. When they get sucked in to me and they're seeing ghosts. There's around every corner you're having a launch bird. I'll do the blank runs. Yeah, it just set it up. I'll even get. You've seen me to where like I'll even pretend like I'm setting up the field to where they think that they know they're on the chain gang or whatever. They see me on the 4-wheeler. I'll go through all the motions. They think that there's birds out there, and then we just go run it. And until they start opening back up and start searching the field harder because they think there's birds out there, then it's like, all right, now we can move back on.
But if we all lived here, none of that shit would be necessary.
Right.
Oh, a lot of this wouldn't be necessary. We'd be out of jobs.
Yeah. Well, guys, before we go off on another tangent, it's getting kind of late here. I know that we have a lot of hunting tomorrow. Tomorrow's that kind of bittersweet day, at least for me. The last day of bird camp, it's always bittersweet. And I know that tomorrow evening we're going to do another podcast. So for anybody that actually made it to this far in this episode, I think I have a fun little unique idea for tomorrow night's podcast. I haven't even told you guys, but ultimately, you hear the old saying that you can only get two dog trainers to agree on, as the third one doesn't know what they're talking about. Since I have three dog trainers, I thought it was time to let's bring back another trainer fight and have a little bit of fun. We're gonna go through some topics, and we're gonna just see where it lands. But I think it'd be a nice little fun difference than us getting on and hopping on our soapboxes and talking about the same stuff over and over
We're all
again.
going to agree.
I mean, I'm here with people I
Yeah.
admire. You didn't
I-
bring any of the people that I'm like, that guy's wrong.
Yeah, give me
but,
that guy.
But I like how all three of us instantly grimaced and then smiled. We're like, ah.
But this should be fun.
This is the most boring. This is gonna be like
Yeah.
those rap battles where they compliment each other instead of dissing each other.
Which, hey, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I've got a list of kind of different topics, and hopefully we don't go too long winded. But anybody listening to this that made it that far, that sounds like fun. I know I have listeners at least once a week. Somebody's like, do another trainer fight, and it's not very often that you have people that are at least put enough thought into what they do. And then not only that, but willing to come on and actually talk about their viewpoints on it. So I thought this was a perfect opportunity to do that. So
Final debate of 2024.
No alarm clocks tomorrow morning.